The icy wind cut through Benedict Arnold's woolen coat like a blade. As he surveyed the treacherous terrain ahead, it was late October, 1775, and the ambitious Continental Army colonel stood at the edge of the Maine wilderness, staring into what many would later call one of the most audacious military gambles in American history. Behind him, nearly 1,100 men shivered in the early winter cold, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Arnold's expedition through the Maine wilderness represented the southern prong of a two-pronged assault on Quebec City, the jewel of British North America, while General Richard Montgomery would advance north through the traditional Lake Champlain route. Arnold's force would take the supposedly impossible path through the Quebec River Valley and across the height of land to the Chaudière River. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: capture Quebec City before winter set in, and bring Canada into the Revolutionary fold. The men who followed Arnold were a motley collection of New England farmers, tradesmen, and soldiers. Among them marched Captain Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen, their long rifles wrapped in oiled cloth against the moisture. These backwoodsmen had already proven their worth at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and their presence lent credibility to Arnold's wild scheme. Also in the ranks was a young Aaron Burr, serving as a volunteer, his keen mind already calculating the political implications of their mission. As documented in Kenneth Roberts' historical research on Arnold's march, the expedition began with high hopes, but quickly descended into a nightmare of logistics and survival. The wooden bateau, hastily constructed in Cambridge, proved woefully inadequate for the rocky streams and countless portages that lay ahead. Within days, the boats were leaking, provisions were spoiling, and men were falling ill from exposure and poor food. Arnold himself embodied the contradictions that would define his legacy. A successful merchant from Connecticut, he possessed the driving ambition and tactical brilliance that made him one of America's most capable field commanders. Yet beneath his competent exterior lurked a vanity and hunger for recognition that would eventually lead him down a darker path. For now, though, he was every inch the patriot hero, sharing his men's hardships and driving them forward through sheer force of will. The landscape they traversed was a primordial wilderness that had changed little since the last ice age. Towering pines and maples created a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Rivers twisted through granite gorges, their waters running black with tannins from fallen leaves. At night, the temperature plummeted and men huddled around smoky fires, their wet clothes steaming in the heat. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Enos commanded the rear division, and his men were already showing signs of the demoralization that would plague the expedition. Provisions were running dangerously low, and the promised supply caches had proven inadequate. Enos faced an impossible choice: continue forward and risk his men's lives, or turn back and face charges of cowardice. His decision would soon split Arnold's force and doom the expedition's chances of success. As they pushed deeper into the wilderness, Arnold's men began to understand the true scope of their undertaking. This was no ordinary military campaign, but a test of human endurance against the raw power of nature. The weak would fall by the wayside, the strong would endure, and the survivors would write their names in the annals of American military history. Behind them lay civilization and safety. Ahead lay Quebec City in either glory or death. The morning of October 30th, 1775, dawned gray and bitter along the Dead River. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Enos stood before his assembled officers, his weathered face reflecting the agonizing decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Around him, his division of 300 men huddled in their tattered uniforms, their eyes hollow with hunger and exhaustion. "Gentlemen," Enos began, his voice barely carrying over the wind, "we face a choice that no soldier should have to make. The provisions meant to sustain Arnold's expedition had proven woefully inadequate. Barrels of salt pork had spoiled, flour had turned to paste in the leaking boats, and the promised supply caches had yielded little more than disappointment. Mathematics painted a grim picture. If they continued forward, they would starve in the wilderness." Captain Oliver Hankett of the Connecticut militia spoke what many were thinking. "Sir, we've done our duty. No man can ask more of us." The sentiment rippled through the ranks. These were farmers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers. They had signed up to fight the British, not to die of starvation in the Canadian wilderness. Arnold, meanwhile, pressed forward with the main body, unaware that his force was about to be cut by nearly a third. The remaining 800 men struggled through swamps that seemed to stretch endlessly, their feet sinking into muck that pulled at their boots with every step. Captain Daniel Morgan's riflemen, tough as hickory and twice as stubborn, maintained their discipline, but even they were beginning to show signs of strain. The turning point came at the Great Carrying Place, a treacherous 13-mile portage that broke the spirit of many expeditionaries. Men collapsed under the weight of the boats, their strength sapped by weeks of inadequate food and brutal conditions. Some simply sat down and refused to go on, their eyes vacant with despair. Arnold moved among them like a man possessed, cajoling, threatening, and inspiring by turns. According to historical accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, Arnold's leadership during this crisis revealed both his greatest strengths and his most troubling flaws. He shared every hardship with his men, carrying a pack like a common soldier and working alongside them to portage the heavy boats. Yet he also displayed the volcanic temper that would later alienate so many of his colleagues, lashing out at subordinates who dared question his decisions. The expedition's chaplain, Samuel Spring, recorded in his journal the almost biblical quality of their suffering. Men ate their leather shoes, boiled bark for sustenance, and fought over scraps of food that would have been rejected by dogs in peacetime. Yet somehow, they continued forward, driven by Arnold's relentless will and their own stubborn refusal to surrender. When news of Ennis's retreat finally reached Arnold, his reaction was swift and furious. He immediately dispatched a letter to General Washington, accusing Ennis of cowardice and demanding a court-martial. The political implications were staggering. Not only had Arnold lost a third of his force, but word of the retreat would inevitably reach British ears, alerting them to the expedition's approach. The psychological impact on the remaining men was equally devastating. If seasoned officers like Ennis believed the mission was hopeless, what chance did they have? Yet Arnold's force pressed on, driven by a mixture of duty, desperation, and the knowledge that retreat might mean death anyway. They had passed the point of no return. Quebec City lay ahead, and behind them stretched hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. As November approached, the survivors of Arnold's march began to emerge from the forest, their clothes in tatters, their faces gaunt with hunger. They had traveled over 300 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in North America, but their ordeal was far from over. Ahead lay the St. Lawrence River, Quebec City, and a rendezvous with destiny that would test not only their courage, but the very foundations of the American cause. The first sight of the Chaudière River on November 2nd, 1775, should have filled Benedict Arnold's heart with relief. Instead, the muddy waters rushing toward the St. Lawrence represented yet another obstacle in an expedition that had already tested human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. Of the 1,100 men who had started the journey through Maine, fewer than 700 remained, and these survivors looked more like scarecrows than soldiers. Arnold stood on the river bank, his own uniform hanging loose on his frame, calculating the distance to Quebec City. 40 miles of river navigation lay ahead, followed by the treacherous crossing of the St. Lawrence itself. Time was running short. Winter was closing in, and every day of delay strengthened British defenses while weakening his own force. The men who had survived the wilderness march were forged by hardship into something approaching legend. Captain Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen, their long weapons still pristine despite the ordeal, had maintained their discipline through sheer professional pride. These backwoodsmen understood survival in ways that city-bred soldiers could never comprehend, and their presence gave Arnold's force a core of unshakable competence. Among the younger officers, Ehrenberg had distinguished himself through intelligence and adaptability. The future vice president moved among the men with quiet authority, his legal mind already grasping the political implications of their mission. If they succeeded in taking Quebec, Canada might join the rebellion, fundamentally altering the balance of power in North America. The descent of the Chaudière proved almost as treacherous as the wilderness march itself. The river, swollen by autumn rains, carried the expedition's boats through rapids that claimed more precious supplies, and nearly drowned several men. According to period accounts referenced in Justin Smith's comprehensive study of the Quebec campaign, Arnold's force lost several boats to the violent waters, further reducing their already meager provisions. As they approached the St. Lawrence, signs of civilization began to appear. French-Canadian habitant farms dotted the landscape, their occupants watching the ragged procession with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Arnold had hoped to find allies among the French Canadians, who had chafed under British rule since the conquest of New France. Instead, he encountered a population that had learned to be wary of military adventures. Regardless of their origins, The political situation in Quebec was more complex than Arnold had anticipated. Governor Guy Carleton, a capable administrator and experienced soldier, had spent months preparing for just such an eventuality. The Quebec Act of 1774 had granted significant concessions to French Canadians, including recognition of their language, religion, and legal system. These reforms had blunted much of the resentment that American strategists had hoped to exploit. When Arnold's force finally reached Point Levis, directly across from Quebec City, the sight that greeted them was both inspiring and daunting. The ancient fortress city perched on its rocky promontory like something from a medieval fairy tale, its walls rising sheer from the cliffs above the St. Lawrence. The British Union Jack flew proudly from the citadel, a stark reminder of the power they had come to challenge. The crossing of the St. Lawrence on November 13th proved to be a masterpiece of military improvisation under cover of darkness. Arnold's men ferried across the mile-wide river in commandeered boats. Their movements concealed by November fog, the operation required perfect timing and considerable luck. Discovery would have meant annihilation under British artillery fire. As dawn broke on November 14th, Benedict Arnold stood on the plains of Abraham, the same battlefield where General James Wolfe had defeated the Marquis de Montcalm 16 years earlier. The irony was not lost on him. Where British arms had once triumphed over French, American rebels now sought to reverse the verdict of history. The city walls loomed before them, seemingly impregnable. Yet Arnold's force had achieved the impossible. Simply by arriving at Quebec's gates, the men who had survived the march through Maine were no longer the same soldiers who had departed Cambridge 2 months earlier. They had been refined by hardship into something harder and more determined than ordinary troops. Yet as they gazed up at Quebec's ancient walls, even these veterans wondered if their extraordinary journey would end in victory or death. The morning of November 15th, 1775, found Benedict Arnold's ragged army encamped on the plains of Abraham, their cooking fires sending thin columns of smoke into the crisp air. The sight of Quebec City's imposing fortifications in daylight sobered even the most optimistic among his officers. The city's walls, built and rebuilt over more than a century, represented the accumulated military wisdom of both French and British engineers. Arnold himself rode along the perimeter of the city, his experience at cataloging its defenses. The upper town, perched on Cape Diamond, commanded every approach with its artillery positions. The lower town, clustered along the riverbank beneath the cliffs, offered potential access points but would be heavily defended. Most troubling of all, Governor Guy Carleton had been preparing for this moment since the rebellion began. Lieutenant Colonel Carleton, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, understood siege warfare better than most men of his generation. He had spent months strengthening Quebec's defenses, not merely against direct assault, but against the kind of prolonged investment that had broken so many fortresses throughout history. His garrison, though small, was well-trained and positioned to maximum advantage. The political dimensions of the siege were as complex as its military aspects. Arnold carried with him proclamations from the Continental Congress promising liberation to French Canadians and protection for their religious and cultural rights. Yet the habitants remained largely unmoved by these appeals, as documented in contemporary accounts preserved in the Archives nationales du Québec. Most French Canadians viewed the American rebels with suspicion, seeing little difference between British and American rule. Arnold's force was further weakened by the harsh realities of campaign life. Many of his men were nearing the end of their enlistments, and the prospect of spending winter in the Canadian wilderness had little appeal for farmers anxious to return to their families. Desertion became a constant problem, with small groups of men slipping away under cover of darkness to begin the long journey home. The arrival of General Richard Montgomery's force from the south on December 1st brought both reinforcement and complication. Montgomery, a former British officer who had joined the American cause, brought with him 300 additional troops and a train of artillery. Yet his own expedition up the traditional Lake Champlain route had been costly, and his men were no better equipped for winter warfare than Arnold's survivors. Montgomery's assessment of the situation was grimly realistic. A competent professional soldier, he recognized immediately that Quebec City could not be taken by conventional siege methods. The defenders were too well positioned, his own force too small and poorly equipped, yet retreat was politically impossible. The Continental Congress had invested much hope in the Canadian campaign. To abandon it without a fight The conference between Arnold and Montgomery on December 2nd revealed the tensions that would plague their joint command. Arnold, the ambitious merchant soldier, chafed at serving under Montgomery's authority despite the latter's superior rank and experience. Montgomery, for his part, found Arnold's aggressive instincts useful, but worried about his subordinates' tendency toward reckless action. As December wore on, the siege settled into a pattern of occasional skirmishing and constant attrition. British artillery from the city walls made life miserable for the besiegers. While Canadian winter weather took its own toll, men huddled around inadequate fires, their uniforms offering little protection against temperatures that plummeted far below freezing. The supply situation grew increasingly desperate, unlike the British garrison, which could draw upon carefully accumulated stores. The American force depended on uncertain local sources and increasingly reluctant French-Canadian farmers. Many habitants, initially neutral, began to see the Americans as a burden rather than liberators, their sympathy further eroded by the rebels' inability to pay for provisions and hard money. Montgomery's engineers conducted careful reconnaissance of the city's defenses, searching for weaknesses that might be exploited. The lower town, they concluded, offered the best opportunity for a successful assault. Its buildings clustered close to the water's edge, providing cover for attacking troops, and its defenses, while strong, were not as formidable as those of the upper town. By late December, both American commanders understood that time was running out. Enlistments would expire with the new year, and their force would melt away regardless of military considerations. If Quebec City was to be taken, it would have to be soon, before winter completed what British arms had begun. The stage was set for a desperate gamble that would determine not only the fate of the Canadian campaign, but the future of the American Revolution itself. The blizzard that struck Quebec City on December 30th, 1775, seemed like an omen to the shivering American soldiers huddled in their inadequate shelters. General Richard Montgomery stood in his headquarters, a commandeered farmhouse outside the city walls, studying maps by candlelight while snow pelted the windows. Beside him, Benedict Arnold traced possible assault routes with his finger, his scar face reflecting the desperation that all felt. "We have perhaps 48 hours," Montgomery said quietly, his cultured British accent still evident despite months of commanding American rebels. "After that, the enlistments expire, and we'll be lucky to have 200 men left." The mathematics of their situation were brutal. Of the original force that had set out to conquer Canada, fewer than 800 effective soldiers remained, and many of those were already packing their belongings in preparation for the journey home. Arnold's response revealed the aggressive instincts that had carried him through the Maine wilderness. "Then we attack tonight. The storm will mask our approach, and the defenders won't expect an assault in such weather." It was a desperate gamble, but both commanders understood that conventional siege warfare was no longer an option. They lacked the numbers, the equipment, and most critically, the time for a prolonged investment. The plan that emerged from the conference was audacious in its complexity. Montgomery would lead the main assault against the lower town from the south, while Arnold struck from the north. Captain Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen would provide supporting fire, and a diversionary attack against the upper town would draw British attention away from the main effort. If everything went according to plan, they would converge in the lower town and fight their way up to the upper town, capturing the city in a single bold stroke. The historical record, as preserved in the papers of the Continental Congress, reveals the political pressure that drove this desperate decision. American commissioners in Europe were negotiating for foreign support, and the conquest of Quebec would demonstrate the rebellion's viability to potential allies. Failure in Canada would confirm British claims that the Americans were incapable of sustained military effort. Montgomery spent his final hours writing letters to his wife and to General Washington, documents that reveal a man reconciled to his likely fate, a professional soldier who had served with distinction in the British Army. He understood better than most the odds they faced, yet duty and honor demanded that he lead his men into battle, regardless of personal cost. Arnold's preparations were characteristically thorough. He inspected his men's weapons personally, distributed what little ammunition remained, and made sure each soldier understood his role in the coming assault. The young Ehrenberg, now serving as Arnold's aide-de-camp, would later describe the scene as resembling a medieval army preparing for a crusade, complete with prayers and last testaments. The storm that had seemed so ominous now became their ally. The howling wind and driving snow would mask their approach, while the British defenders, sensibly, had taken shelter from the elements. Governor Carleton's garrison, though alert, was not expecting an assault in such conditions. The advantage of surprise, so crucial to the success of their plan, seemed within their grasp. As midnight approached on December 31st, the two assault columns began their movement toward the city. Montgomery's force, consisting of his own New York troops and some of Arnold's men, moved carefully along the river path toward the lower town's southern approaches. Arnold, leading the northern column, guided his men through the storm toward the Saltomatella barrier. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on the participants. As 1775 gave way to 1776, American soldiers were preparing to assault the strongest fortress in North America. Success would vindicate their cause and potentially bring a 14th colony into the rebellion. Failure would end American hopes for expanding the revolution beyond the original 13 colonies. The men who followed Montgomery and Arnold into the storm were volunteers in the truest sense. Their enlistments had expired, yet they chose to risk everything on one final throw of the dice. These farmers and tradesmen, merchants and frontiersmen, had been transformed by hardship into something approaching a professional army. They understood the stakes and accepted the risks with the quiet courage that would characterize American soldiers throughout the war. As they approached the city's defenses, the blizzard intensified, reducing visibility to mere yards. The assault that would determine the fate of the Canadian campaign was about to begin, and history would judge whether courage and desperation could overcome the cold mathematics of military power. The clock in Quebec City's upper town struck 2 in the morning. As General Richard Montgomery's assault column reached the first barrier in the lower town, the blizzard that had concealed their approach now turned treacherous. With wind-driven snow making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, Montgomery, leading from the front as was his custom, peered through the storm at the wooden palisade that blocked their path. The barrier was formidable, but not insurmountable. His men had brought scaling ladders and axes, and the defenders seemed to be sheltering from the storm. Montgomery himself took up an axe and began hacking at the wooden posts, his example inspiring his troops to similar efforts. For a moment, it seemed as though surprise might carry the day. The explosion that shattered the morning silence changed everything. British defenders, alerted by the noise of the assault, had loaded a cannon with grape shot and waited for the perfect moment. The blast caught Montgomery's column in a deadly crossfire. The metal balls sifting through the packed ranks like an invisible scythe. When the smoke cleared, Montgomery lay dead in the snow, his body torn by multiple wounds. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, the death of their commander broke the spirit of Montgomery's assault column. Captain Jacob Cheeseman, second in command, was also killed in the initial volley, leaving the survivors leaderless and demoralized. Within minutes, what had been a coordinated assault dissolved into chaos, with men fleeing back through the storm toward their own lines. Meanwhile, Arnold's northern column was experiencing its own catastrophe. The Saltomatella barrier proved more strongly defended than intelligence had suggested, and the narrow approach channeled his men into a deadly killing ground. Arnold himself was struck down early in the assault, a musket ball shattering his left leg and leaving him writhing in the snow. Captain Daniel Morgan, the Virginia rifleman who had survived the wilderness march through sheer determination, assumed command of Arnold's column. A frontiersman with little formal military training, but vast experience in wilderness warfare, Morgan understood immediately that the assault had failed, yet retreat was nearly impossible. British defenders had closed the trap, and his men were caught in a deadly crossfire. The fighting in the narrow streets of the lower town took on an almost medieval character. Morgan's riflemen, their long weapons useless in close combat, drew tomahawks and knives to fight their way through the maze of buildings. The British defenders, reinforced by Canadian militia who knew every alley and hiding place, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. Captain Lamb's artillery company, supporting the assault, found their cannons virtually useless in the storm. The wind scattered their shot, while the narrow streets made it impossible to deploy their guns effectively. One by one, the artillery pieces were abandoned as their crews joined the infantry. In the deadly street fighting, young Ehrenberg, attempting to rally the scattered remnants of Montgomery's column, displayed the courage that would later make him a political force in the new nation. Racing through the storm, He gathered up survivors and led them in a desperate attempt to resume the assault, yet without proper leadership and facing determined resistance. Even Burr's efforts proved futile. The British response was swift and professional. Governor Carleton, awakened by the sound of battle, immediately ordered reinforcements to the threatened points. Lieutenant Colonel Allen McLean, commanding the garrison, deployed his troops with the skill of a veteran officer, using the city's layout to maximum advantage. The narrow streets that the Americans had hoped would provide cover became death traps. As British marksmen fired from windows and rooftops by dawn, the assault had collapsed completely. Montgomery was dead, Arnold was wounded and captured along with most of his men, and the survivors were retreating through the storm toward their own lines. Captain Morgan, surrounded and outnumbered, was forced to surrender after a fierce final stand in a lower town courtyard. The butcher's bill was staggering. Of the 800 men who had participated in the assault, nearly 400 were killed, wounded, or captured. The British losses were minimal, fewer than 20 casualties in total. More importantly, the cream of the American officer corps in Canada had been eliminated. Montgomery was dead, Arnold was prisoner, and many of their subordinates had shared similar fates. As the storm finally began to clear on the morning of January 1st, 1776, the survivors of the assault struggled back to their lines. The sight that greeted them was one of complete defeat, scattered equipment, abandoned weapons, and the knowledge that their bold gamble had failed utterly. The dream of bringing Canada into the American Revolution had died in the snow-covered streets of Quebec City. The gray dawn of January 1st, 1776, revealed the full extent of the American disaster. Colonel Benedict Arnold, his leg shattered by a British musket ball, lay on a stretcher in the British-controlled lower town, his face a mask of pain and fury. Around him, the survivors of his assault column sat in dejected silence, their dreams of conquest replaced by the harsh reality of captivity. Governor Guy Carleton, surveying the battlefield from the safety of the upper town, felt a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. The American assault had been bold and well-conceived, but ultimately futile against proper defensive preparations. The bodies of General Montgomery and his officers lay where they had fallen, testimony to the price of military ambition. Carleton ordered that Montgomery be buried with full military honors, a gesture of respect for a fallen enemy. The political implications of the defeat rippled far beyond the walls of Quebec City. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress received news of the disaster with shock and dismay. The Canadian campaign, which had consumed precious resources and raised hopes of expanding the rebellion, had ended in complete failure. Worse still, the loss of experienced officers like Montgomery could not easily be replaced. Captain Daniel Morgan, the Virginia rifleman who had survived the Wilderness March only to be captured in the final assault, found himself in the unusual position of being a prisoner of war. His reputation as a marksman had preceded him, and his British captors treated him with the wary respect due a dangerous enemy. Morgan would later escape and return to the American cause, but for now, he was just another casualty of the failed Canadian adventure. The survivors of the assault, who had escaped capture, faced an even more daunting prospect: retreat through the Canadian winter to the safety of American lines. Without proper winter clothing, adequate supplies, or effective leadership, many would not survive the journey. The expedition that had begun with such high hopes was ending in a tragic comedy of errors and miscalculations. Historical analysis, as documented in sources from the National Archives, reveals that the Quebec campaign's failure stemmed from fundamental strategic miscalculations. American leaders had overestimated French-Canadian support for the rebellion while underestimating British defensive capabilities. The assumption that Canada could be conquered by a single bold stroke proved fatally flawed. The human cost of the campaign extended far beyond the battle casualties. Hundreds of men had died during the Wilderness March, victims of disease, exposure, and starvation. Many more would die during the retreat, their bodies lost in the vast Canadian wilderness. The families they left behind would receive little compensation for their sacrifice, and their names would be largely forgotten by history. Benedict Arnold's capture and subsequent treatment revealed both his resilience and the contradictions that would define his legacy. Despite his wounds, he remained defiant in captivity, impressing even his captors with his courage and determination. Yet the seeds of his later betrayal may have been planted during these dark months as he witnessed the cost of what he saw as inadequate support from his own government. The failure at Quebec also had broader implications for American strategy. The dream of a continental revolution encompassing all of North America died in the snow-covered streets of the Lower Town. From this point forward, American leaders would focus on defending the original 13 colonies rather than expanding the rebellion northward. The aftermath of the battle saw both sides claiming victory. Though the reality was more complex, the British had successfully defended their stronghold and eliminated a significant threat to their North American empire. Yet the mere fact that a ragtag army of American rebels had marched hundreds of miles through the wilderness to assault the strongest fortress in North America demonstrated a level of determination that would prove troubling for British strategists. The French-Canadian population, caught between competing loyalties, largely remained neutral throughout the conflict. The promises of liberation made by American propagandists rang hollow after the military failure, while British concessions following the Quebec Act provided sufficient incentive for continued loyalty to the Crown. Canada would remain British, a fact that would shape North American politics for generations to come. As spring approached in 1776, the survivors of Arnold's expedition struggled homeward, their faces bearing the marks of hardship and defeat. They had attempted something extraordinary, the conquest of Canada by a handful of determined rebels. Though they had failed, their courage and sacrifice would become part of the foundation myth of American independence. The Battle of Quebec, fought in a blizzard on the last day of 1775, marked the end of American dreams of continental revolution. Yet in its failure, it also demonstrated the resolve and resourcefulness that would eventually secure American independence. The men who died in the snow-covered streets of the Lower Town had not died in vain. They had proven that Americans would fight for their beliefs even in the face of impossible odds. Their legacy would inspire future generations of Americans, reminding them that freedom sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice, and that even failed dreams can light the way to eventual victory.